Well, hello everyone. My name is Mellis Howard. I'm a director at Archio Architects, and really delighted this year to have been invited by the London Society to curate a series of talks on changing ways of living. We had 2 talks previously this year on the theme, covering topics of well-being and high density after COVID and hyper-local London. And tonight the topic is the value of housing. So value in the context of housing, it's a very multifaceted term. Value in terms of financial value of housing as a commodity or even as an investment. Value in terms of that primary value of having a roof over your head, the stability and the personal well-being that comes from having a secure home. Then you might think of best value. What's the cost of a home, and particularly how can we get best value from designing and building housing? And finally, I think the topic we will focus on, which is social value. It's a term that is oft bandied about by architects and developers and local authorities, but we're questioning what does it really mean and how can we add social value through new housing. So this evening, I have to admit, I'm going to hand over the reins mostly to our associate, James Purkiss from Archio. He's going to be presenting a housing scheme that's live, as in it's submitted to planning recently, and I'm picking the issue of social value in particular and asking how we can and how we feel we have delivered wider social value benefits through this process of designing homes. And the process is not one that we can take all the credit for at all. It's an absolutely collaborative effort. And we're really delighted to have 3 panelists joining us this evening who've been really central to this project. Firstly, we've got Sydney Sims, who's a member of the Southwark Youth Advisors, who collaborated on the project, joining the residents' engagement events with I would say the group has the overarching ambition of creating positive change in their community and representing the voice of young people. Secondly, the project's a council-led project led by Southwark Council, part of I don't know if we can call it a new wave of council-led housing anymore. It's quite established now, but we have Rachel Askew, project manager from the new homes development team at Southwark Council, who led this project from the outset, in collaboration with the residents of the estate. And finally, we have Helen Reid, an associate at Pitman Tozer Architects, who co-authored the Southwark Council's design standards. And that is a document which really guides and unpins the quality standards for the council's housing. So I'm hoping she can answer questions along those lines. So how this evening is going to work, or at least until around 7:20, is that James is going to present the project, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to answer some questions. And afterwards, we're going to have questions from the audience. So the format for that is if you could please add your questions to the Q&A, I'll take a look at them as we go through the evening and ask them at the end. So I think that just leaves me to hand over to James to present the project before we have questions to the panelists.
Great, thank you, Mellis. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that slide. Great. So this is me and Zadie, and I'm starting with this illustration from a socially distant site visit earlier this year, because at Archio we're really inspired by people like Zadie, people who strive to make their communities better and who give so much of their time and energy to make that happen. Zadie leads the Tenants and Residents Association on the Askew Cooper estate and has played a key role in this project from the very beginning, long before we became involved, probably even before Rachel, who's joined us, became involved too. Working with her as a part of the resident project group has been one of the highlights of this project. And on a personal note, I've got to say I'm looking forward to taking up her offer of a table tennis match once we've got our planning permission, hopefully. We're also really excited to have Sydney here. Sydney was another key member of the resident project group. This is the Askew estate. And it's on the edge of the Old Kent Road, an area which is rapidly changing. Zadie lives here, and it's a big moment for her. New developments, including what could be a very tall tower on the other side of Road Cross Street, marked with that green arrow, are bringing lots of new people to the area, and existing residents are facing potential dislocation. So I think it's reasonable that existing communities represented by people like Zadia are asking, how will this benefit us and how can we be involved? This is our site. So it's a cluster of 12 garages and a substation on the edge of the estate. When the garages were first identified as a potential site for development, Zadie volunteered to join the resident project group. And I just thought at this point I should acknowledge that when we're thinking about social value, we also need to factor what's being lost through development. And we were aware from the beginning that these garages, which aren't going to be replaced, provide little benefit to the community, but they do have a significant value to the people who lease them at the moment. We're aware of overcrowding issues on this estate and understand that it's likely that some of them are used for storage to ease some of that burden. So just to say, Southwark are committed to find these people replacement garages where they can, and that's something that applies across the development programme. This is the community brief, and the first job of the resident project group, which Zadie joined at the beginning of the project, was to produce this document. And it's something that Southwark officers produce with residents at the start of every project, like this one, before they appoint design teams. The brief covers residents' hopes and fears for the development, and also lists their priorities for estate improvements, which Southwark commit to undertake alongside the development of new homes. I think it's important here to mention the role that the community brief had in our selection as architects. So we, in our tender, were asked to demonstrate how we would respond to this brief and to share our initial thoughts around the issues that residents had raised in it. This is a drawing that we produced to summarize some of the conversations that we've had with residents over the last 11 months working on this project. And I'm going to use it to highlight some of our key approaches to community co-design. Part of the reason why we think that community brief, like we inherited on this project, is so important is because it engages residents at the very start. And this matters because we think community co-design is the way to deliver maximum social value through housing projects like this one. So on the following slides, I'm going to describe what we're calling wider estate improvements and explain how our conversations with residents help to shape those. And I'll get onto the building design towards the end of the presentation. So we always start by listening. One of the things that we read in the community brief, and which became even clearer in our workshops with residents, is that they want their estate back. What did they mean by this? They wanted to feel safe and secure on their estate, but told us that antisocial behaviour issues, which have been worsening over the last couple of years, have made them feel unsafe, particularly moving through their estate. And they also told us that these issues are stopping them from making best use of shared facilities. For example, we heard that the TNRA hall is underused at the moment because parents didn't want to send their children walking across the estate. Zadie also told us of her frustration that a grant-funded project for an outdoor gym hasn't gone ahead because of the wider residents' fears that that might attract further antisocial behaviour. So the message is that antisocial behaviour on this estate has become a barrier to change, positive change. So we really wanted to understand this problem, and asking questions is key to that. And our questions included, what do you think are the causes? What are the solutions? And what has already been done? We heard that narrow, poorly overlooked routes through the estate contributed to people feeling unsafe when moving through it. But the main issue we heard was that people were driving onto the estate, parking up by a football pitch, playing loud music from their cars, and in the words of one resident, selling things they shouldn't be. previous efforts to address the antisocial behaviour had failed, and we heard from residents that gates that had previously been installed on the entrance to the estate had been vandalised and were no longer in use. So, like Zadie, we understand that making small interventions can make a big difference. Zadie and other residents suggested installing automatic bollards or gates on the estate entrances to stop people driving into the estate. And they were really convinced that addressing that issue or addressing the antisocial behaviour in that way would be enough to allow residents to take their estate back. And so this is what we're proposing alongside the development of the new homes, to install some automated gates at the entrances to the estate. The residents were also hopeful that this would subsequently allow them to fulfil their other plans, like the outdoor gym, and also an extended programme of events in the TNRA hall. And this is where Sydney comes in. So at our first workshop with residents, we were aware that we had no younger members, so no younger people represented in the project group. And we felt this was an issue. We felt that to deliver maximum benefit for all the people on the estate, we needed the group to be representative of them. And we also felt that younger voices would be key to understand the causes and potential solutions to the antisocial behaviour issues. So we had a look around and found out about the Southwark Youth Advisors, and we invited them to join. And they really have been key contributors in subsequent workshops. I'm just going to describe one area where their input has been particularly formative, and that's been in our discussions around what to do with the football pitch, which actually is just creeping into the top of this slide. Residents had identified the football pitch as a major source of antisocial behaviour, and also noise issues. So the landscape architects that we're working with, MRG Studio, presented possible solutions to this, including adapting the pitch to encourage younger people to use it. So the proposal was to possibly add new markings to the football pitch, playful like feet and other things like that. The young advisors were really clear on this. They warned us that it would disenfranchise young people, or had the danger of disenfranchising young people who really valued this facility. There are relatively few opportunities for this type of play and spaces like this that are dedicated for the older, younger people. So we listened. When we're proposing to leave the pitch alone, and instead we're proposing to add more planting around the pitch to buffer some of the noise, which was the kind of joint concern of residents alongside the antisocial behaviour. We, in the workshops that we've held, we've also discussed opportunities to address other issues on the estate. One of these was the lack of age-appropriate play equipment. So there is a playground, and actually, I think this is my colleague Carl pointing at it here. The existing playground equipment is outdated and in poor condition. And residents also told us that it's quite difficult to supervise children of different ages because the play equipment is only suitable for the very youngest children. We saw this as an opportunity for the new development. So planning requirements, as I'm sure many of you are aware, dictate that we need to provide new play space alongside new development. But rather than creating a separate playground for these new residents, we're proposing to replace and extend the existing playground to provide a new space that's going to accommodate children of a much wider age range, and this is going to allow parents to supervise children of different ages at the same time. We also, in the workshops, discussed issues of overcrowding, as I mentioned before, and this has informed the proposed mix of flats in the new building, which includes 8 larger family homes. Southwark's local lettings scheme means that tenants living locally in housing need will be given priority for those. So this slide shows a range of tools that we use to facilitate community co-design and that we used in these workshops. I'm going to briefly describe how we use some of them on this project. So we always start with a hopes and fears exercise. We feel like it's really important that we understand these, including what is motivating residents to get involved. in a project like this. And it's important also to help us understand the thinking behind resident suggestion or their responses to our proposals in later workshops. This is a project flow diagram. And if we're going to deliver social value as architects, we really feel that we need to design how to engage with people. And this is an example of that. We've adapted or adopted this format after seeing how residents on previous projects have been bamboozled by Gantt charts, and they're probably not the only ones, find them quite hard to read. So we produce these to explain our process to residents and also to identify where we're going to engage them and ask for their input. And I think this is really a key part of our efforts to shift the power dynamic, turning the development from something that's done to residents to something that is done with them. This is a screenshot of a collective mapping exercise, and we usually do this kind of thing with post-it notes in person, but this is Miro, an online whiteboard that we have been using for online engagement events from the start of the pandemic, and it's been a great substitute. And on this project, it was a really important exercise to help us to understand where exactly the antisocial behaviour issues were, and also to understand how people really moved through the estate. So onto the building. This is a view of the front of the building, and I've talked about how conversations with residents have helped us to deliver social value through targeted estate improvements. And I'm going to talk now about how our same thinking extends into the design of the new homes. The building provides 20 new social rent council homes over 8 stories and doesn't quite fit on this slide. The thing that I wanted to draw attention to in this view is the widened route through the estate to the communal playground behind. So I'm pointing with my mouse here. This is the new route between the building and the adjacent building, Lapland House. And I think even in the setting of the building, what I'm explaining here is that we're trying to think about how the setting of the building can improve the wider estate. This is the ground floor plan. And what this is showing is the relocation of the existing substation that's dotted in red into the ground floor of the building. And that's really what's made it possible for us to widen the existing route, which at its narrowest was under 2 meters, to something now that is between 5 and 6 meters wide. And also that's that new route. And then I'm also highlighting here another route that we're reinforcing at the back of the building that links 2 of the key outdoor spaces on the estate, so the playground and the football pitch area. Previously, this route was constrained by the garages, but also had steps in it, which meant that it wasn't accessible to wheelchair users. So we understood that the opportunity with this building was to create improved routes. We also saw an opportunity where the 2 routes crossed to create what we're calling a mini square. And this mini square is at the point of the entrance into the playground. And this will hopefully become a key place for residents to meet. This is the view from the playground looking back at that space. So the gate to the playground is just there, and we're looking at the back of the building. And a point of discussion here with residents was whether or not to include benches. So from the outset, the residents were concerned that adding benches really anywhere on the estate could become a new focus for antisocial behaviour. But I think through our discussions with them, they've come around to the idea of including some here where residents can sit and watch their children play. And I think they were sufficiently convinced that the introduction of new balconies on the building in this corner of the new playground square would provide sufficient passive supervision to mitigate the risk of that new antisocial behaviour or further antisocial behaviour. This is the view from the opposite corner looking up Rowcross Street. From what I've already described, you can hopefully see that we take a resident-centric approach to design. And that involves thinking about the impact on existing residents as well as the needs of new residents. And I think this view allows us to highlight a couple of points in the design which respond to both. So when building close to existing homes like we are here, on the right-hand side is the existing building Askew House. There's a risk of overshadowing and overlooking of existing residents. And what this view shows is that we've located balconies on the front of the building where they look away from the existing homes in Askew House. What it also shows, which is perhaps a subtler point, is that we're thinking about the privacy of new residents. So we're showing brick balconies, and also we're not showing any full height windows. So there's no issues with views up into the flats from the street below. This diagram is describing some of the key environmental strategies for the building. And in developing these, we've been considering ongoing costs to future residents. So environmental outcomes are factored in social value frameworks and are therefore critical to delivering social value. But in fulfilling Southwark's commitment to net zero, we're really aware of the risk of not wanting to put cost burden on residents. So as with any housing project, the main use of energy in this building will be for heating. As a part of all of their projects, Southwark commission heating options appraisals, and these consider emissions alongside maintenance and cost to residents. So the proposal for this building is for a fully electric strategy, and it's great for emissions, but because electricity remains more expensive than gas for heating, there is a risk that residents could face fuel poverty if we can't deliver flats that can be heated efficiently. So for us on this project, it meant working with the environmental engineers to design flats that would be easy to heat with as little energy as possible. And we've done that by giving the building an efficient form factor, which I'm noting here, by specifying mechanical ventilation for heat recovery, and by proposing solar thermal panels on the roof. So this is Southwark's new home design standards, and they produced this to help ensure the delivery of quality housing. And we're very fortunate to have Helen with us from Pitman Tozer, who was one of the co-authors of the standards. So I should say we can't take all the credit for the design measures that we've described, and some of the things that I've already described are covered in the standards. In fact, most of them, and the solid brick balustrade is an example of that. I'm going to just use this plan of a typical upper floor to highlight a couple more of the points from the design standards. So the standard requires that all homes with more than one bedroom must have a separate kitchen, and you can see these here on this plan. I've highlighted them in yellow, and the adjacent living spaces in blue. And as we've already mentioned, that there's issues of overcrowding on the estate, and it's safe to assume that most of these flats will be fully occupied with every bed space in use. The advantage of having a separate kitchen and living room is that both can be used simultaneously by different members of the household. For example, a child doing homework at the kitchen table, whilst another family member might be watching TV. So I think this is a kind of a different approach than you're likely to find in market housing, where those spaces tend to be joined. Another thing to just point out is the standard is asking for private outdoor amenity spaces. In this case, we're showing balconies that are a minimum of 10 square meters. And this is a lot higher than the planning policy requirement. In terms of the one bed, it's flat, which is down here, it's double the size of the minimum planning requirement. So this is my last slide. It's a view from the first floor terrace of one of the larger homes, and I'm going to conclude now. So I'd say that I hope we've managed to convey how we've sought to deliver maximum social value on this project by working with brilliant people like Zadie and with other people in the community like Sydney. I hope we've also managed to convey the critical role of Southwark's community brief and the new homes design standards. In addition to providing 20 much needed new homes, this project should hopefully deliver benefits for the existing residents and wider community by encouraging better relations with residents or between residents and young people, by making people feel safer on their estate, and ultimately by creating new opportunities for them to meet and form new connections. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, James. Well, I'm gonna turn to the panel and ask a few questions. Maybe we should stop sharing a screen so we can all see each other. It might be that I ask you to share your screen if there's a particular picture that needs some illustration. And also just a reminder to our audience, please can you submit if you have any questions on the Q&A, and I might intersperse the kind of questions I have already for the panel with those and come to them at the end. I think I've prepped Sydney that I'm going to ask her a question first. And I think in a way, Sydney, I want to ask you to give you the opportunity to tell us a bit more about the Southwark Young Advisors. Could you tell us what motivates the group to become involved in development in your borough and to create change?
Okay. So just on that point, generally, a lot of the team, we all are young people. No one is over the age of 21. So we all are young. And so we connect on a ground level with all other young people. And I also say a lot of us have personal experience of things being done for us, but around us, rather than including us in the process. A lot of the time, people assume what young people want rather than just asking them. And a lot of the time, young people aren't, they don't readily come to events like this, purely because it's easy for a young person to feel like an imposter in the room, especially when you're using language like antisocial behavior, regeneration, and so on. Young people are a lot more capable than a lot of people give us credit for. And so our role is to basically, as our slogan says, empowering communities and changing opportunities. So we want to empower other young people to feel like their voices are important and they can get involved in processes like this.
I mean, eloquently and nicely said, Sydney. I was going to move on to someone else, but I just feel I'm going to ask you my other kind of burning question about it since we're in a role. So obviously on this project, you were brought in to represent the voice of like the missing young people on the estate, because it felt really important that they were represented when when the tenants were talking about issues with young people. And I guess that puts quite a lot of burden on you to represent people that you don't know. And I wonder if you could talk about, whether in this project or other projects, how you approach representing young people to make sure that you're representing the voice of the kind of wider voice of young people.
Yeah, so generally, as I've been in the role for a long time, you do not get thrown into the deep end. There is a lot of support. So before I came on this process, I already had experience in talking on behalf of other young people. At the end of the day, I'm not talking for myself, I'm talking for everyone, as the question implies. And it's just about thinking about different young people, especially when we're looking at antisocial behavior. There's a clear differentiation that needs to be made between young people that generally want to enjoy the area that they live in and other young people that are moving to the premises and that are actually causing antisocial behavior. And it's just making sure that young people aren't being mistaken for carrying out antisocial behavior when generally they just want to use the facilities that are around. So for me, my main thing was making sure that young people within the community actually have space there if they do want to use the space properly, and making sure that that isn't being overcrowded by this fear of antisocial behavior, which on this estate especially is carried out by other people coming to the premises.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting, because I think it is, you take on a lot by representing a lot of people. So you have to sort of feel empathetic and with voices that you don't necessarily know. So that's really interesting to hear. I think maybe this is time to turn to Rachel. We've talked a lot about social value, and in a way we at Archio like talking about it because it's quite an undefinable thing. And I wonder if you could just talk more widely about Southwark Council's agenda for delivering social value on this project and others.
Yes, so I suppose the kind of overarching aim of the project is to deliver new homes and new council homes for people. Obviously, there's a big waiting list in the borough of people that are in need of housing, and so it's about using the resources and the work that we're doing to provide new homes as a kind of a catalyst and an opportunity to strengthen those communities and provide something for those existing residents and the new residents that might be moving on to an estate. You know, acknowledging that residents might be losing garages or experiencing inconvenience through construction works, and can we offer them something, you know, positive benefit out of the project as well. And also, as James mentioned, we operate a local lettings policy. So, you know, a lot of the residents that might be moving into the new homes are existing residents that already live on an estate or part of a community. And by engaging with us in the consultation process, they can have suggestions and, you know, ways of improving their existing community.
And maybe that takes me to the sort of second part of the question, Rachel, is that did you find it easy to engage with people on the estate? And because obviously you were involved in the project long before we were, and you worked on this really good community brief. Could you just tell us a bit about how that was formed and how you initially contacted people and got them interested in kind of having a voice in the change in their estate?
Yes, I mean, working on different projects, you know, across the borough, it's different. This one, they have a really fantastic Tenants and Residents Association, and the chair and secretary of that are very involved and have, you know, been very easy to work with as part of this process. I think the first time we attended was, or event I went to was pre-COVID, so I went to their kind of Christmas party for the sort of older people on the estate. I think they had an Elvis impersonator there, and that was, you know, a way to, you know, get to know people a bit more there and just talk to people about the project on a sort of informal basis. Then we, in terms of developing the community brief, we had a series of online workshops with residents that put themselves forward to join the project group. And as part of those, we talked to residents about their kind of hopes and fears and concerns, both about the new development and estate improvements, and kind of came up with lots of ideas at the beginning and then worked with them to kind of prioritize the things that they thought were most important to them, and produced a document, which was a sort of longer community brief and then a shorter summary version that went to everybody on the estate. And that was used as part of the tender process for the architects, and we evaluated the tender submissions based on how well architects have responded to that.
There's maybe a question, well, I think I'll come to it. There's really some really good questions on the Q&A, which I'm sort of tempted to drop in, but I'm going to ask Helen a question first, and then I think we can go on to the Q&A, just to encourage people to keep asking, because they're really good questions. I think, Helen, we talked about, or James talked about, I can't take any credit, about the design standards towards the end of his project. And I wondered if you had sort of what the engagement process for you to produce those design standards were. And because we always talking about like a resident-centric approach, and in a way that's what we read in the design standards. And I wonder if you could talk about your engagement process through that when creating that. Yeah,
I mean, it was different. We talked with Southwark about how important it was to get the residents in the wider community than just the, you know, site boundary of what you're building to engage at the early stages. And that was probably one of the newest additions to this version of the standards, was the initial part of it, of like setting out the framework for how people should engage to get a successful kind of result, because you don't want something to happen where, you know, the residents only see it when it's just about to go into planning, and then it feels a bit late to really have an influence on it. And I think there's a real belief that early engagement, like was just described, really does make better design. And so, you know, in writing the standards, which cover the whole of the borough of Southwark, which has got an enormous like diversity of like neighbourhoods, even from street to street, we couldn't, you know, expect to engage with everyone to write the standards. And then if we did, we'd end up with a very detailed and long, massive book like this. Really, we're just trying to set out the framework to clearly define between Southwark and the architects how they could go out and what the expectation was in how they should go about doing it, so that you could get a unique outcome for your specific sites, because they're all different.
maybe there's something interesting, because James talked about how there's a requirement to have separate kitchen and bathroom. I wonder if there's other things that are kind of particularly
Yeah, yeah. So that's the other side of them, the kind of more detailed back end of them, which is when you're kind of you've kind of got the strategic stuff sorted, and then it's down to the detail. And that really came from Southwark's kind of estate managers and development managers, and people who've seen the whole lifespan of housing estates over 20, 50 years old, and how they work well and where they maybe are not so great for maintenance, or where the neighbours, you know, complain more. Like that example there was people being frustrated that, you know, kids need to do homework at the same time that someone needs to cook them dinner. It just doesn't work having a massive open plan space all of the time. So that's just a really practical, you know, outcome.
I think that's well, I think it's been really useful for us as a checklist, and it's a particularly easy to read design document. I've had a really good question. We've had loads of really good questions. My brain is kind of struggling to take them all in and ask questions. So I'm now going to move to the written Q&A questions from the audience. And I think this one is one for everybody. So Stephanie Goldberg asks, how do you address competing issues among residents and resident groups? Is it ever an issue? And I mean, maybe that's a question for Rachel to start with, because it sort of implies there's lots of projects going on. And then maybe Sydney could add to that too. So Rachel, how do you address competing interests among residents?
I mean, one thing we did do initially as part of the development of the community brief was a survey in between the workshops, where we asked people to kind of vote for different items. So then we could kind of quantify the suggestions that had been made, and could then discuss with residents those specifically, and say, you know, 3 people like this idea. Is this something that's important to lots of residents, whereas only 1 person like this thing? And that helped with that kind of prioritization exercise. But yes, I suppose it's about having an open conversation with people and talking through kind of the implications of some of the estate improvement options. For example, on other schemes, suggestions have been made for things like community growing projects, or a football pitch on a different project. But obviously the experience of this one meant that we could talk about that and say, you know, is that something that you actually want?
Yeah.
And yeah, work through it.
Sydney, you had the experience of that on this one, because people were saying they wanted one thing and you came in with a different opinion. So how did you manage that in your role in this project?
Yeah, I think also just on the back of what Rachel was saying, the prioritizing exercise really did work, because ultimately on this estate, we did establish that we all want one thing, as James said, is to take back the estate. There is a lot of people coming and using the facilities incorrectly when it is for the residents that live there. So I feel like because we had that same goal, it was just trying to let them recognize that yes, they may want to take the pitch and decorate it for younger people, but when they then get older, it's then they're going to feel like they can't use the facility in the way they can. So as James was talking about earlier, it's about making age appropriate facilities, and we kind of stress that as young advisors, that older younger people are a part of the community too, and they need to feel like they have a space there rather than having to travel away when they have facilities on their doorstep.
I think I'm just going to let you also, Sydney, answer this question as a bit of more of a plug for the young advisors. Emily Foster asked, do you know of other boroughs who have set up something like Southwark Young Advisors?
Yeah, so the Young Advisors charity is all over England. The closest boroughs to us, the newest one is Lambeth, and Wolverhampton Forest have been running for the same amount of years as us.
Cool. Thank you. I think I might ask a difficult question now. I can always rely on Claire Richards to ask a difficult question about social value. And so as she says, social value has become a tool of measurement in the built environment, yet that value is all about what already exists, not just what can be added. Local voices are central to that. So how can we arrive at a broader definition to be widely adopted by councils and developers to spread this good practice? I mean, personally, how can we define what social value is a really, really difficult question to answer, because I think it means different things for different people. And I know that Rachel, you've done some work trying to understand how to quantify it, but I'm not asking you to kind of have the answer, but any thoughts on that question?
I suppose in a way, it's maybe about recognizing that it does mean different things to different people and to different communities, and saying it's not this one thing. And I suppose it's nice to be able to measure things and quantify them and package it up nicely in a report and say, you know, this is what we achieved, but maybe it is about acknowledging that it's difficult to do that. And the feedback is perhaps more anecdotal rather than.
I think this is the quandary, isn't it? Because, you know, as architects, we have to always describe how we're delivering social value, and it's totally, I think, comes down to our attitude. You know, there's measurable things to do with how many people you employ from a local area, etc. But the kind of core of it, I think, comes down to an attitude and a kind of ambition, and which is why I think James has spoken about the community brief, and that being the thing that you're asking architects to respond to when they start a project on all your sites. And I think that, for me, illustrates kind of Southwark's attitude towards it, that the community are asking the questions of the architect to win the job, which I think is really fundamental. So go on, James.
I'd just say on that, it's helped us to understand social value in the particular context of this project and this estate.
James, since you've popped up there, there's a question from anonymous attendee. Maybe it's your wife asking you this lovely question. Thank you, James, for a very, very informative presentation. I have two questions. What part of working on the estate did you enjoy the most, and any advice on engaging and connecting with residents with different cultural backgrounds and age groups? I mean, I feel like we've covered the question about age group perhaps with Sydney's involvement, but
I mean, number one is easy to answer. I think it was probably the last project group meeting where Sydney said she could see how we'd taken on board the comments in our design. That was great. That's what we want to hear. But I think also really from the very start, working on a project where the community brief was fundamentally supportive of development, and I think we've really felt that we've kind of ridden the crest of a wave on this project. And I know that they're not all quite this, we're not always as fortunate on other projects to have that level of support and engagement from the very beginning. I think, we've talked about identifying in that first workshop that we held that we didn't have younger people represented. I think the issue with people from different cultural backgrounds, I don't think was applicable in this project. I think the project group we inherited was already diverse, and I think actually maybe the bigger challenges in the last year has been engaging people who aren't like digitally literate and who weren't able to engage in that way. And I think that's where we've really relied on the brilliant TNRA members, including sorry, broken up.
Don't worry.
So I think that's, we've really relied on the residents to go wider and to find those voices that of people who haven't been able to join the sessions.
Thank you, James. I think there's a question for Helen, I think, that's very detailed from someone who's also anonymously named as a series of numbers, maybe someone who seemingly has read the document closely. But I'm going to turn the question around a bit. They're saying, I wonder if activity zones outlined in the appendix to the documents have been applied too strictly. It looks like the interpretation's been flexible, and they describe how some of the things in the kitchen, the space around the dining table has been changed, allowing for better shapes of rooms. I suppose to ask the question there is about how did you, Helen, approach this document, allowing for it to be kind of flexible but also giving the kind of design quality that was necessary? Because I suppose my interest in that question is that design documents, I think, either fall to be too woolly or absolutely insanely specific for sort of no apparent reason. And I think what you have done in your co-authoring of this document is to describe something that's really about quality of life and having good quality of life. And I think, so in a way to take this person's question, ask it again, is how did you think about how design standards could be adapted to make good quality homes, particular to the site, let's say?
Yeah, I think we didn't want this document to be prescriptive, that set out it must be, you know, 5 meters by 10 meters by this, because you come up with generic outcomes and not appropriate to the site. And also the start of great design is really to trust the architect and have a good architect to do that. And I think, you know, we're starting from that premise. We know the designers can interpret the site well. We don't need to tell people how to design a house. We're just trying to point out some of the things that are universally unique to Southwark in the things that they've learned. So where we do have something prescriptive, like, you know, have a separate kitchen if it's a large house, that is directly from lessons learned. It's not from a kind of abstract hypothesis about good design. It's directly from reality, and that's the only time it's been prescriptive. In the only other, so the whole document is really structured to design the process of the design rather than the design outcome, because if we were to say it has to look exactly like this and that, then you're not going to get unique projects that fit well on the sites and you reflect the place they're built in.
Yeah. Thanks, Helen. I think designing the process is something that we talk about loads in Archio. I think we're quite sort of process focused, and maybe sometimes even this evening when we were thinking about this presentation, we're like, are we talking about architecture enough? This is all about process, but it's really fundamental to us. I think the last question I might ask is sort of combining two people's questions of if you could all just respond about the challenges of the project and those that require compromise, or any tensions between the kind of the design and what the brief required. So perhaps that's more for James and Rachel, I suppose.
I mean, one of the challenges, I would say, and one of the key early moves was moving the substation. I think I've seen there was another question about that, actually.
Yes. I didn't want to, that was a really difficult question. I wasn't going to ask it to you.
I mean, I do have an answer to that one.
Okay, how will you mitigate the detrimental effect of electric magnetic waves?
I mean, I like a detailed question. The substation is actually a separate building, and it sits underneath the terrace, so it doesn't have any adjacencies with habitable rooms. I hope that answers Nikki's question. But I think, yeah, that in terms of overcoming a challenge, it really was moving that substation. It's quite a big thing to do, and has a cost associated with it. And I think one of the things that we worked with Rachel on during the initial stages of the project was, and when we were talking about viabilities, was whether we could justify the cost of moving it. And I think moving the substation, widening that route with the benefits that it has, also means that we're realistically able to create a taller building than we would have been able to otherwise. So the benefit has been delivered through it being attached to more housing. But overcoming it involves like really understanding the financial implications of that decision.
I feel like, James, you've maybe brought us very, very neatly full circle to the title of the talk.
Oh, really?
Value of housing. Yeah, well done. I think, we started talking about the value in its definitions, and moving the substation is a really expensive thing to do and took a lot of discussion. Well, I'm going to take that back. It's a fairly expensive thing to do. A lot of discussion as a group, because we're really talking about what's the ultimate value here. Is it worth it to make a better place for people to live? Is that safe, wide route that you can visually see through from the main road into the playground worth the bother of moving the substation? And I guess these are a number of decisions that come along through the process. And I think engaging the residents group to also ask that question and like Sydney said earlier, take on the voices of the residents and the young people in a really straightforward and professional way, and say, this is what we're looking at. This is going to cost X amount. That's less for your housing or your estate improvements, but this is the value it will deliver. It's kind of what it's all about. And I think we really care that we shouldn't be making decisions, sitting at our drawing boards. It's a really collaborative decision-making process. So I said we'd finish at 7:20, it's 7:21. So I'm going to draw it to a close and just thank all the attendees and all the panelists, Rachel, Sydney and Helen and James. And just thanks so much for coming along. And any further questions, please get in touch with us on Twitter. I'm happy to continue the dialogue. And thank you very much.